Imagine for a moment that you are sitting in your bedroom late at night, and suddenly you hear a voice calling your name from the darkness outside your window. Every instinct tells you to answer, to call back, to ask who is there. But what if I told you that in dozens of letters, diaries, and journals spanning 3 centuries, people were explicitly warned never to respond to such voices after sunset? What if those who broke this rule left behind accounts so disturbing that their families burned the documents, and entire communities adopted rituals of silence that persist in forgotten corners of Europe to this very day? We are going to journey into a world where night was not merely the absence of sunlight, but a threshold into something else entirely. A world where the boundary between the living and whatever lay beyond was considered dangerously thin after dark, and where speaking into that darkness was thought to invite catastrophe. But this was not superstition born of ignorance. These were educated people, physicians, lawyers, clergy, military officers, who recorded their warnings with the precision of scientists documenting a natural law. They wrote as if they had witnessed something that proved beyond doubt that certain sounds, certain responses, certain words spoken after nightfall could fundamentally alter reality itself. To understand the depth of this phenomenon, we must first immerse ourselves in the Europe of the 18th and 19th centuries, a landscape far stranger than our sanitized history books suggest. Picture the cities of that era, not as quaint historical settings, but as something altogether more unsettling. The architecture alone should give us pause. Walk through the old quarters of Prague, Vienna, Edinburgh, or St. Petersburg today, and you will find buildings of such massive scale, such intricate stonework, such impossible engineering that they seem designed for inhabitants twice our size. Doorways tower 3 meters high. Windows stretch from floor to ceiling in proportions that dwarf modern humans. Staircases wind upward with steps so broad and tall that climbing them feels like scaling a giant's dwelling. The official explanation claims these dimensions were purely aesthetic, that our ancestors simply preferred grandiose proportions. But examine the infrastructure beneath these cities and a different picture emerges. Vast tunnel networks, underground chambers with vaulted ceilings reaching 10 meters or more, aqueduct systems of such complexity that modern engineers struggle to map them completely, stone blocks weighing dozens of tons fitted together with precision that would challenge contemporary construction technology, lifted into place by methods that remain genuinely mysterious despite all our modern knowledge. And everywhere, evidence of a building boom so extensive, so coordinated, so impossibly rapid that it suggests resources and capabilities far exceeding what official timelines attribute to these periods. Consider the demographic paradox. Official records from the 1700s show European cities with populations in the mere hundreds of thousands, sometimes just tens of thousands. Yet these same cities possessed infrastructure designed for millions, sewer systems that could handle waste flows 10 times greater than the recorded population, water supply networks with capacity exceeding demand by orders of magnitude, public buildings, administrative centers, judicial complexes, all built on a scale suggesting governance of far larger populations than any census ever recorded, churches and cathedrals that could hold the entire official population of a city simultaneously, raising the obvious question: why would struggling communities invest such enormous resources in structures so vastly oversized for their needs? The people of this era lived within these architectural mysteries without, it seems, finding them mysterious at all. They wrote letters, kept diaries, recorded their daily lives in remarkable detail, and threaded through these personal documents, appearing with disturbing regularity, were references to the night sounds, not the ordinary sounds of nocturnal animals or late travelers, but something else. Voices that called with perfect familiarity, knocking patterns that seemed to know household rhythms, whistles and songs that mimicked deceased family members with uncanny accuracy. And across hundreds of these accounts, a consistent warning: never, under any circumstances, respond after dark. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. One of the earliest detailed accounts comes from a letter dated 1743, written by a German physician named Johann Wilhelm Hartmann to his brother in Leipzig. Hartmann had been called to a rural estate in Saxony to treat a young woman who had fallen into what he initially diagnosed as a nervous disorder. But as he investigated the case, the symptoms proved unlike anything in his medical training. The woman, 19 years old and previously in perfect health, had begun answering voices in the night. Her family had heard nothing, but she insisted that someone called her name repeatedly from the forest behind their manor. On the 4th night, she had opened her window and called back, asking who was there. What Hartmann recorded next should have been dismissed as delusion or fabrication, yet his clinical precision and evident distress suggest a physician confronting something that shattered his rational worldview. The woman claimed that after she called back, the voice began speaking to her in a language she did not know but somehow understood. It told her things, she said, about the house she lived in, about rooms that no longer existed, about people who had occupied those rooms in times before any record. She described architectural features that her family insisted had never been part of the manor. Yet when Hartmann examined the foundations, he found evidence of precisely the structures she described buried beneath the current building. But far more disturbing was what happened in the following nights. The woman began to change. Hartmann documented it with a physician's attention to detail. Her speech patterns altered, adopting phrases and grammatical constructions that had been common a century earlier but had long since fallen out of use. Her handwriting transformed, taking on characteristics that a local antiquarian identified as matching styles from the 1600s. She spoke of events in the estate's history that were confirmed only when Hartmann dug through church records and found obscure documents referencing incidents that perfectly matched her accounts. Yet she was not possessed in any traditional sense. She remained herself, recognized family and friends, went about her daily activities normally. The changes were subtle, as if something had been added rather than replaced. She knew things she could not possibly know, used words that had been forgotten, remembered places that had ceased to exist generations before her birth. And every night she insisted the voices came back, teaching her, showing her, pulling her deeper into connection with something that existed just beyond the threshold of the visible world. Hartmann tried everything in his medical arsenal. He prescribed rest, fresh air, tinctures, bleeding, all the treatments of his era. Nothing changed the fundamental reality. The woman had responded to the night voice, and something had responded back, opening a channel that could not be closed. In his final letter to his brother, Hartmann wrote with barely controlled panic that he was beginning to hear the voices himself. He had stayed too long at the estate, listened too carefully to the woman's accounts, allowed his rational mind to become too entangled with the phenomenon. He was returning to his practice in Dresden immediately, and warned his brother that should he ever hear his name called in the darkness, he must seal his windows, cover his ears, and above all, never, never speak back. But what makes Hartmann's account particularly significant is that it was not isolated. Throughout the 1700s and 1800s, similar cases appeared in records across Europe. A Scottish minister in 1768 recorded 3 members of his congregation who fell into similar states after responding to night callers. A French magistrate in 1781 documented an entire family in Normandy who began experiencing collective visions of their village as it had existed centuries earlier after the youngest daughter answered a voice in the night. An Austrian military officer in 1803 reported soldiers in his garrison who claimed that responding to night sounds had given them knowledge of battles fought on their posting grounds long before recorded history. The consistency of these accounts is what demands attention. These were not illiterate peasants sharing folk tales around a fire. They were educated professionals, members of the emerging middle class, people trained in observation and documentation. They wrote in matter-of-fact tones about phenomena that should have seemed impossible, as if recording natural history. And crucially, they all emphasized the same warning. The night voices were real, responding to them had measurable consequences, and the safest course was absolute silence after dark. Now consider what this implies about the nature of night itself in that era. We modern people think of darkness as simply the absence of light, a neutral condition remedied by electric lamps. But perhaps night was something more substantive then, more present, more capable of containing or transmitting phenomena that our artificially illuminated world has simply pushed aside rather than eliminated. The people of those centuries lived in darkness of a quality we can barely imagine. No streetlights, no indoor lighting beyond candles and oil lamps, no electric glow seeping from every window. When the sun set, true darkness fell, and in that darkness they heard things. But what were they hearing? The rationalist explanation would claim acoustic phenomena, wind patterns, animal calls, the brain's tendency to pattern match random sounds into familiar voices. Yet this explanation crumbles against the documented effects. People who responded to the voices did not merely imagine consequences. They acquired verifiable knowledge. They described architectural features that were later confirmed. They spoke in linguistic styles that perfectly matched earlier historical periods. They knew details of events that existed only in obscure archives. This was not hallucination. This was information transfer of some kind, occurring through an auditory channel that operated specifically at night. Some researchers have suggested that what we are seeing here is evidence of residual consciousness, places and times retaining impressions of past events that can be accessed under specific conditions. The night voices in this interpretation were not supernatural entities, but rather echoes, recordings somehow embedded in the environment and activated by human attention. Responding to them created a connection, allowing information to flow from past to present, overlay old reality onto new perception. But there is another interpretation, darker and more disturbing, that emerges when we examine the broader context of these accounts. Notice that the warnings about night voices appear during the same centuries when we see the massive building projects, the infrastructure designed for populations that official records claim never existed, the architectural mysteries that suggest capabilities beyond what the documented technology should have allowed. Notice that the voices seem to pull people backward in time, connecting them to earlier versions of their environments, to knowledge that had supposedly been lost. What if the voices were not echoes of the past, but rather something trying to recover information from people who had forgotten their own history? Consider the implications. You are living in a city with infrastructure for millions, but the population is officially recorded as mere thousands. You inhabit buildings designed for inhabitants larger than yourself. Your entire civilization seems to have been built by someone else for someone else. Yet there are no records, no memories, no collective understanding of how this came to be. Then at night, voices call from the darkness, and those who answer begin remembering things that predate their own lives, describing places that no longer exist, speaking in languages and styles from earlier eras. It is as if something is trying to remind you of what was forgotten, trying to bridge a gap in collective memory, trying to reconnect you to a history that has been erased. The question becomes not what the voices were, but what happened to create the amnesia they seemed designed to remedy. What occurred to make an entire civilization forget who built its cities, who designed its infrastructure, who created the systems it now inhabited as if they had always existed? And why would responding to attempts at remembering be considered so dangerous that warnings about it persisted for generations? We find clues in the strangest places. Medical records from the 1700s contain an unusual number of cases involving what physicians called genealogical delirium, patients who became convinced that their family trees were incorrect, that they descended from lineages not recorded in official documents. Many of these patients claimed their delusions began after hearing and responding to night voices. They would describe ancestors who did not appear in church records, family estates that supposedly never existed, inheritance rights to properties that had supposedly never been built. Their claims were dismissed as fantasy, yet when investigated, traces of what they described could often be found in architectural remnants, in old property boundaries, in foundation stones buried beneath current structures. One particularly well-documented case involved a merchant in Hamburg named Friedrich Weiss in 1779. After responding to a voice that called his name while he worked late in his counting house, Weiss became obsessed with the idea that his family had once been far more prominent than current records suggested. He claimed to remember, though he could not explain how, a different version of Hamburg, one with additional districts that no longer existed, trade routes that were not in any contemporary maps, guild structures that had supposedly never been organized. His descriptions were detailed enough that a local historian became interested and began investigating. What the historian found was deeply unsettling. Buried in municipal archives were fragmentary references to precisely the districts Weiss described, but dated to a period supposedly before Hamburg had grown large enough to encompass such areas. Old property deeds mentioned streets that did not appear on any map, but whose names matched what Weiss recalled. Trade records referenced guild classifications that official histories claimed had never existed in Hamburg. It was as if Weiss had somehow accessed memories of a city that had existed in a different timeline, a Hamburg that had been larger, more complex, more developed than the one that supposedly grew gradually from a small medieval town. But the most disturbing discovery came when the historian examined demographic records. He found evidence of a massive population collapse around 1700, a reduction so severe that it should have devastated the city. Yet there was no corresponding plague, no war, no famine documented for that period. The people simply disappeared from the records, and the city continued as if nothing had happened, only with far fewer inhabitants. Official histories attributed this to record-keeping errors, suggesting that earlier population figures had been inflated or later ones undercounted. But the infrastructure told a different story. The Hamburg of 1700 had water systems, sewage capacity, street layouts, and public buildings designed for a population far larger than the few thousand recorded in the supposedly corrected census of 1710. Weiss died in 1783, still insisting that he remembered a Hamburg that had never officially existed. His family burned most of his papers, embarrassed by what they considered his madness. But a few letters survived, and in them Weiss described something that should make us profoundly uncomfortable. He claimed that, after he began responding to the night voice, he started to remember not just a different Hamburg, but a different history entirely. He wrote of vast projects completed in mere years, of construction techniques that made no sense given official accounts of available technology, of populations moving and reorganizing in patterns that suggested coordination on a scale impossible for the fragmented political entities that supposedly existed then. And he wrote of silence, of a deliberate, organized suppression of memory, as if something had occurred that required humanity to forget. He described it as a kind of collective amnesia, enforced not through physical violence but through the systematic destruction and rewriting of records, the elimination of witnesses, the gradual replacement of one history with another. According to Weiss, the night voices were remnants of the earlier history, trying to remind people of what had been erased, and the warnings against responding to them were part of the suppression, ensuring that the new history remained unchallenged, that no one remembered enough to question the narrative they had been given. Now you might reasonably ask why anyone would undertake such an enormous effort to rewrite history. What could motivate the systematic erasure of entire populations, capabilities, and timelines from collective memory? Weiss suggested an answer that seems almost too vast to contemplate. He believed that civilization had been reset, that humanity had been reduced from a far more advanced state, and that those who survived or those who orchestrated the reduction needed everyone to forget what had been lost. The evidence for such a reset is circumstantial but extensive. Consider the abandoned infrastructure beneath so many European cities, tunnel systems, and underground chambers that served no apparent purpose for the populations that lived above them, yet were built with engineering precision that suggests serious industrial capability. Consider the massive agricultural terracing found throughout Europe, earthworks that would have required coordinated labor of thousands to create, yet were supposedly built by scattered medieval communities with no central organization. Consider the roads, the bridges, the canals, all designed and constructed to serve transportation and communication needs that vastly exceeded what official population figures would have required. And consider the buildings themselves, not just their size but their construction methods. Stone blocks weighing tons fitted together without mortar, precisely cut and placed. Foundations that extend far deeper than structural requirements would necessitate, as if designed to support much taller structures than currently exist. Evidence of construction techniques that official histories claim were not available until centuries later. It is as if the cities we inherited were built by a different civilization entirely, one with capabilities we have only recently begun to recover, and we have simply moved into their structures while forgetting they were ever anything other than what we made ourselves. The night voices, in this interpretation, were a kind of breakthrough, moments when the suppressed history tried to reassert itself, when the amnesia cracked just enough for information to leak through. People who responded found themselves connected to memories that were not their own, or perhaps were their own but had been deliberately forgotten. They began to see their surroundings as they had been, not as current narratives claimed they had always been. And this made them dangerous because they contradicted the official story, raised questions that were not supposed to be asked, remembered things that were supposed to stay buried. The warnings against responding, then, were not about supernatural danger in the traditional sense. They were about social danger, about the risk of contaminating oneself with forbidden knowledge, of becoming a carrier of memories that challenged the accepted version of reality. Those who heard and responded to the night voices became, in effect, living contradictions to the established history. They had to be isolated, dismissed as delusional, sometimes removed entirely from society. Their accounts were burned, their claims ridiculed, their memories attributed to madness rather than to access to suppressed information. But the voices persisted throughout the 1700s and 1800s, suggesting that whatever they represented was not easily eliminated. And the warnings persisted too, passed down through generations, encoded in family traditions and local customs. In some regions of Eastern Europe, you can still find elderly people who will not speak after sunset, who insist on silence once full darkness falls. When asked why, they often cannot articulate a reason, only that it is what they were taught, what their grandparents taught them, going back generations. The original context has been forgotten, but the behavior persists, a fossil of the era when responding to night voices was considered genuinely dangerous. As we move into the 1800s, the character of the accounts begins to shift. The voices do not disappear, but references to them become less frequent in the letters and diaries that survive. This could mean they genuinely became rarer, or it could mean that people stopped writing about them. That discussion of such phenomena became increasingly taboo. The Industrial Revolution was transforming Europe, bringing new technologies, new forms of organization, new ways of thinking about reality. The rational materialist worldview that would dominate the modern era was beginning to assert itself, and within that framework, night voices and the effects of responding to them had no place. Yet occasionally, accounts still surface. An 1827 letter from an English railway surveyor describes workers who refused to continue excavating a tunnel after some of them claimed to hear voices calling from the rock face. When asked what the voices said, the workers would not specify, only that they had been warned never to respond, and that continuing the excavation felt like breaking through into somewhere that should remain sealed. The project was completed using different labor crews, workers brought in from distant regions who had no knowledge of local traditions and no reluctance to dig, but several of those workers later reported strange experiences, hearing their names called from inside completed sections of the tunnel, feeling compelled to answer and finding when they did that they knew things about the tunnel's construction they could not explain, as if they remembered building it before, though they had only just arrived. Or consider an 1842 account from a French architect hired to renovate an old manor in Burgundy. While working on the foundation, he discovered evidence of an earlier structure beneath the current one, far older and built with techniques he did not recognize. That night, staying in the manor, he heard someone call his name from the basement. He recorded that every instinct told him to investigate, to call back, to ask who was there. But the housekeeper, an elderly woman who had served the family for decades, heard him moving toward the basement stairs and physically blocked his way. She told him, with what he described as absolute terror in her eyes, that he must never respond to voices in that house after dark, that answering them was how the previous architect had lost his mind, how 2 servants had disappeared years earlier, how knowledge that should not be known came into the world. The architect did not respond, but his curiosity was inflamed. He began researching the manor's history and discovered that it had been rebuilt at least 4 times, each time on the foundations of an earlier structure, going back to periods for which no reliable records existed. Each rebuilding had reduced the overall size of the complex, as if successive generations were unable to maintain or even use the full extent of what previous inhabitants had constructed. The basement he had been called to extended far beyond the current manor's footprint, suggesting that the original structure had been vastly larger. And in that basement he found inscriptions in Latin warning about speaking into the darkness, about answering calls that came without visible speakers, about the danger of allowing the past to speak through present throats. What the architect realized, and what modern researchers of these phenomena have confirmed through study of similar sites, is that these warnings were not superstitious ravings, but practical safety instructions recorded by people who had learned through bitter experience that certain behaviors produce specific dangerous outcomes. They were treating the night voices as a natural phenomenon, one that could be managed through specific protocols, much as we today have safety procedures for handling hazardous materials or entering confined spaces. The difference is that we understand the dangers we warn against through scientific explanation, while they understood their dangers through direct observation without necessarily comprehending the mechanism. But what if they did comprehend the mechanism, or at least intuited it? What if they understood that they lived in a world that had been reset, that beneath their present reality lay earlier versions, earlier inhabitants, earlier capabilities, all somehow still present, still accessible under certain conditions? The night voices, from this perspective, were the earlier versions trying to manifest, trying to overlay themselves onto the current timeline, trying to reassert the history that had been suppressed. Responding to them allowed that overlay to strengthen, gave it a channel into present consciousness, enabled past knowledge to contaminate present understanding. And this was dangerous not because the past knowledge was inherently harmful, but because it contradicted the carefully maintained narrative that justified the current order. If people began remembering that their cities had been built by previous inhabitants with greater capabilities, if they began questioning why official records showed such small populations in infrastructure designed for so many more, if they began noticing the demographic impossibilities and architectural anachronisms that surrounded them, then the entire structure of historical narrative would collapse. They would realize that they were living in the ruins of something greater, that their civilization was not a progression from primitive to advanced, but rather a recovery from collapse, a slow crawl back from catastrophic reduction. The implications of this realization would be revolutionary. It would mean that progress is not linear but cyclical, that civilizations rise and fall and leave behind ruins that later inhabitants occupy, while forgetting who built them. It would mean that we cannot trust official histories, that records have been systematically altered or destroyed to hide genuine discontinuities in human development. It would mean that the technologies and capabilities we think we invented might actually be rediscoveries, that knowledge we believe is new is actually very old, recovered rather than created. By By the mid-1800s, industrialization was providing an alternative explanation for the architectural mysteries that had puzzled earlier observers. Steam power, mass production, coordinated labor enabled by railways and telegraphs, these made rapid construction and vast projects seem possible without invoking vanished civilizations or lost capabilities. The official narrative shifted to accommodate the evidence. Yes, the cities were built quickly and on a grand scale, but this was due to the revolutionary technologies of the industrial age, not to any previous advanced period. Yet this explanation creates its own problems. The major European building boom actually occurred in the 1700s and early 1800s, before industrialization reached the scale that would have enabled such rapid construction. The railways that supposedly made it possible were themselves built through landscapes already featuring infrastructure that predated rail transport. The factories that supposedly provided materials operated in buildings whose construction techniques they could not replicate. It is as if industrialization was not the cause of the building capacity but rather the explanation retrofitted to make sense of capacity that already existed from unknown sources. And the night voices did not stop with industrialization. They continued, though increasingly they were interpreted through new frameworks. Spiritualism emerged in the mid-1800s, providing an alternative explanation for nocturnal sounds and voices, attributing them to spirits of the dead rather than to echoes of suppressed history. This had the effect of making such phenomena seem less threatening to official narratives, because spirits could be explained away as subjective experiences or fraud, while voices that conveyed verifiable historical information were far more difficult to dismiss. Yet even in spiritualist literature, careful reading reveals accounts that do not quite fit the spirit hypothesis. Mediums who claimed to channel the dead sometimes conveyed information about places and periods that suggested not contact with individual deceased persons, but access to some kind of temporal record, a preserved imprint of earlier times. And the warnings about responding to night voices persisted among families and communities that had experienced their effects, even as the broader culture developed new explanations that stripped away the original context. By the late 1800s, electric lighting was beginning to transform the nature of night in European cities. Streets that had been dark for millennia suddenly blazed with artificial illumination. Interiors that had relied on candles and gas lamps now had electric bulbs. The quality of darkness changed, became less absolute, less present, and with this change, reports of night voices began to decline sharply. By early 1900s, they had become rare enough that researchers interested in such phenomena had to seek out remote rural areas to find people who still experienced them. This correlation between artificial lighting and decreased nocturnal phenomena is itself suggestive. If the voices were purely psychological projections of internal fears onto external darkness, then light should not have affected them, or at least not affected them so consistently and completely. But if they were genuine phenomena that required specific environmental conditions that operated through properties of darkness that artificial light disrupted, then their decline makes perfect sense. We did not eliminate the voices by understanding them better or by curing the delusions that supposedly caused them. We eliminated them by changing the environment, by filling the darkness with light, by creating conditions under which they could no longer manifest or be perceived. But eliminating perception is not the same as eliminating presence. Modern urban dwellers rarely experience true darkness. Even at night, light pollution ensures that cities glow, that complete blackness is never achieved. We have surrounded ourselves with constant illumination, and in doing so, we may have simply pushed certain phenomena beyond the threshold of accessibility rather than actually eliminating them. The night voices might still be present, still calling, still trying to connect present with past. We simply can no longer hear them through the electromagnetic fog of modern existence. And occasionally, even now, in places where darkness still falls completely, where artificial light does not reach, people report experiences that echo the historical accounts. Hikers in remote forests hear their names called with no visible source. Researchers spending nights in abandoned buildings report voices that seem to know details about the structure's histories. Maintenance workers in old tunnel systems describe calls that seem to come from sealed sections, promising knowledge if only someone would respond. But modern people, lacking the cultural context of the warnings that once circulated widely, often do respond, and when they do, they sometimes report effects that match the historical pattern. Sudden knowledge of architectural features later confirmed to exist, speech patterns that shift to match earlier periods, vivid memories of events they never experienced, a sense of living simultaneously in present and past versions of the same location. These cases are typically dismissed as unusual psychological reactions to isolation and darkness, but the consistency with accounts from centuries earlier suggests continuity of phenomenon rather than coincidental similarity of delusion. What are we to make of all this? The rational mind seeks to dismiss it entirely, to file it under superstition and outdated belief systems. But the evidence resists easy dismissal. Too many credible witnesses, too much specific, verifiable information, too many patterns that persist across centuries and cultures. At minimum, we must acknowledge that people in past eras genuinely experienced something they interpreted as night voices, that responding to these experiences had measurable effects, and that warnings against such response were based on observed outcomes rather than baseless fear. But the deeper question is what this tells us about the nature of history itself. If places can somehow retain impressions of past events, if conditions can arise that allow past information to manifest in present consciousness, then our understanding of time as a simple linear progression may be inadequate. Perhaps the past does not disappear but remains present, layered beneath or alongside current reality, accessible under specific circumstances, capable of intruding into present awareness when barriers thin. And if this is true, then what happened to create the barriers in the first place? Why would access to past information need to be blocked? What occurred that made it necessary to prevent people from remembering earlier versions of their civilization? The evidence points toward a catastrophic event or series of events that required not just physical rebuilding, but psychological rebuilding, not just repair of infrastructure, but repair of collective memory, not just survival, but selective forgetting. The cities we inherited suggest populations far larger than official records acknowledge. The construction techniques suggest capabilities far greater than documented technology should have allowed. The infrastructure suggests coordination and organization far exceeding what fragmented political entities should have achieved. And the systematic warnings against listening to voices that might reveal this discrepancy suggest that someone, at some point, decided that humanity needed to forget what had been and accept a diminished version of itself as normal. Perhaps that someone was not a conspiratorial group, but rather necessity itself. Perhaps the catastrophe was so severe that survivors could only cope by forgetting, that rebuilding could only proceed if people did not dwell on what had been lost. The night voices, then, were the past trying to insist on being remembered, and the warnings against them were the present trying to maintain the amnesia necessary for psychological survival. Or perhaps the truth is darker still. Perhaps the reduction was intentional, organized, designed to bring humanity down from whatever heights it had achieved, and the amnesia was enforced to prevent recovery. The night voices were resistance to this enforcement, remnants of the old order trying to re-establish themselves through any channel available, and the warnings were part of the suppression mechanism, ensuring that people remained isolated from their own history. We may never know with certainty. The records are too fragmentary, too compromised by centuries of selective preservation and destruction, but the pattern remains, visible to those willing to look, undeniable in its consistency. Our civilization is built on ruins we do not understand, inhabiting structures we did not build, following layouts we did not design, using infrastructure whose origins we have forgotten. And at night, when darkness falls completely, when artificial light does not reach, the past sometimes tries to speak, calling names into the void, waiting for someone to answer, ready to remind them of what was lost. The warnings tell us not to respond, that answering brings danger, that knowledge from beyond should remain beyond. But the warnings themselves are evidence that something is there to respond to, that the voices are not imagination but phenomenon, that the past is not safely buried but rather waiting, persistent, patient, ready to overlay itself onto present consciousness whenever present consciousness becomes receptive. And so we return to that moment at the beginning, imagining ourselves in darkness, hearing our name called from nowhere. Every instinct tells us to answer, to acknowledge, to engage. But centuries of warnings, recorded by people who learned through terrible experience, tell us to remain silent, to seal ourselves away, to let the darkness pass without response. They knew something we have forgotten, understood something we no longer recognize. They lived in the transitional period between catastrophic forgetting and total amnesia, and they try to warn us that some doors, once opened, allow things through that cannot be pushed back. Whether we heed those warnings or ignore them may determine whether we remain in our diminished present or rediscover the heights from which we apparently fell. The night voices still call, in places where darkness remains absolute. They still offer knowledge, still promise connection to what came before. And we must decide, each in our own moment of darkness, whether the risk of remembering outweighs the safety of forgetting, whether we want to know what our civilization truly is, or whether we prefer the comfortable lie that we are the first, the only, the pinnacle of human achievement, rather than the survivors struggling to recover from a fall so catastrophic that we erased all memory of the heights we once commanded.